Ladies and gentlemen, in our uncertain times, it is good to have one thing we can all hopefully agree on. Global catastrophes are undesirable. We have come together today to discuss disasters that might be so low in probability, yet have so much impact that they would threaten the future of humanity. This is a rather frightening topic. But we are in Japan, the world's most disaster-prone country. So I trust you will bear with us as we will talk you through, firstly, what we believe characterizes such existential threats, and then secondly, what we propose to be done in order to mitigate them. Luckily, we're in Kyoto here today, and Kyoto is known to be comparatively safe with regards to natural disasters, so the good news is that we have chances of surviving these following 45 minutes. My colleague Dr. Avin and me, we are humbled to be invited here and to give this keynote lecture, and therefore let us greet you very briefly in Japanese as well.
皆様、こんにちは。まずはじめに、北野先生、河合先生、磯部先生、森先生、柴田先生、矢沢信先生、今回はお招きいただき誠にありがとうございます。私たちは物理学を専門としている哲学者、シャバ・アビンと、環境法と、災害法を専門としている法学者、私です。2人ともイギリスのケンブリッジ大学の
Center for the Study of Existential Risk という研究センターで、
人類の絶滅リスク、特に科学技術がもたらすリスクの管理について研究しております。5年前に私はここ京都大学に、博士学生として留学したことがありますので、今回こうやってここで基調講演をする機会をいただき、大変感謝しております。では、ここからは英語で続けさせていただきます。
This is our planet Earth in a picture taken by the Voyager 1 probe 6 billion kilometers away in space. With this picture, astronomers like Martin Rees remind us that we humans are custodians of a small, pale blue dot in a vast cosmos, and that for now, this is the only place we have. So we're well advised to preserve and to protect it. It is the cosmologist's perspective that can help us overcome our limited horizons of time and space, and to understand that nothing is eternal and no species has survived on this planet forever. Our starting point is as follows. Whether by error, by terror, or by war, humanity has reached the technological capability to cause its own extinction. In the 21st century, anthropogenic risks, inter alia stemming from technological advances in fields such as bioengineering, artificial intelligence, or weapons systems, have come to exceed geo- or astrophysical risks. There are countless threat scenarios that we have become overly familiar with through disaster and science fiction films, but in this lecture, we want to take a step back and seek the underlying components that make up all of these extreme scenarios. For this, we will present a classification system which showcases the complex and multifaceted nature of such global catastrophic risks. This classification system, which projects risk components along 3 dimensions, is not intended for theoretical contemplation. It is designed to help expose commonalities and to direct our attention to specific vulnerabilities as well as opportunities for greater resilience in the real world. Very much in the spirit of this conference and its organizers, our system carries a clear message for interdisciplinarity and international cooperation to constantly update and stay ahead of emergent future risks and to think the unthinkable. These challenges in mind, the University of Cambridge established the Center for the Study of Existential Risk. Our acronym for it is CSER. Our aim is to examine the most extreme, low probability, high impact threats to humanity. We concentrate on the identification, management, and mitigation of risks that might result in a global catastrophe or threaten human extinction, even if only with very low probability. In particular, we focus on emerging and future technological risks that are plausible and tractable, but still understudied and poorly characterized. Admittedly, humanity has been concerned about its own end for a long time already, not only in the realms of religion or philosophy, but also in science. However, only quite recently have we started to seriously approach existential risk with a multidisciplinary approach beyond single scenarios. Thinkers in Oxford and in Cambridge were at the forefront of promoting this field, which is rapidly expanding in the English-speaking world. Of course, we do not want to tell our Japanese friends here at this school for integrated studies on human survivability how challenging, ambitious, and rewarding such interdisciplinary research can be. With regard to natural disasters, indeed it was Japan, where already in 1892, right after the Nobi earthquake, the world's first interdisciplinary scientific research body was established. The Imperial Earthquake Investigation Committee, Shinsai Yobo Chosakai, which soon turned Japan into a world leader in seismology, and today many more hazards. The idea for our center in Cambridge was born when Jan Tallinn, whom some of you will know as a co-founder of Skype, shared his concern on future developments in artificial intelligence with Hugh Price, Bertrand Russell Professor of Philosophy, and Martin Rees, who is, among many other very interesting things, author of the book, Our Final Century. With encouraging support, including from the Templeton World Charity Foundation, we could grow very quickly. So recently we were able to hire a new full-time team member almost every month. This picture on the slide shows our team. You can see some of our soon-to-be 10 postdocs, Martin and our 2 directors, Sean and Hugh. But there are about 30 more very diverse figures formerly part of our center who manage and advise us, including the astrophysicist Stephen Hawking, whom you will have recognized on this picture already, and the philosopher Nick Bostrom, who heads our sister institution in Oxford, and technologists, namely Elon Musk. We postdocs contribute our very different backgrounds, ranging from mathematics, physics, genetics, ecology, economics, risk governance, and biosecurity, to combine and complement methodological capabilities. As our science advances, we gain a better understanding of a broad class of global catastrophic risk scenarios. We call them GCRs. These global catastrophic risk scenarios could, in severe cases, take the lives of a significant portion of the human population and may leave survivors at enhanced risk by undermining global resilience systems. Some severe GCR scenarios have posed a persistent threat to humanity since our emergence as Homo sapiens. For instance, we have the impact of an astronomical object here on the slide and a supervolcanic eruption. Other scenarios have increased in likelihood over time with our population expansion and increased vulnerability through networks. Some of these are, for instance, natural pandemics. Where do we have the natural pandemics? Over here. And there's also a nuclear winter scenario, which we have over here. or there could even be engineered pandemics. We will hear more on this topic from Professor Mitsuyama. Other scenarios are more speculative. For instance, weaponization of advanced artificial intelligence over here, or environmental shocks from ill-judged geoengineering, efforts to mitigate climate change, which we will hear more about tomorrow as well. There is considerable and relevant debate in the English scholarship on global catastrophic risks about the definition of these terms and about their severity and scope. But this conference quite explicitly discusses risks to the future of humanity. So it does so in the broadest sense. So let's leave away the terminology for a minute and let's ask the really important question. The billion-dollar question is, which scenario should we prioritize on now? Which scenarios can be safely done away with? And how can we arrive at these conclusions? To help addressing this question, we will present our risk classification framework. But before handing over to Dr. Avin, let me close this introduction with a few more remarks on our working hypotheses. First, and by definition, scholars in the field of existential risk prioritize extinction-level threat scenarios over conventional disasters. This is not only because, in comparison, existential risk is understudied, underfunded, and underaddressed. Given the low probability, time and resources can seemingly be better spent. Most elected politicians do not think ahead for more than 4 years, and most executives' time horizons are much shorter. The time horizon for us, however, is the 21st century. What is more, we prioritize on extinction-level threats using an argument of altruism based on demographical comparison. The value of future generations affected by any such catastrophic event would outnumber all the value of currently living humans. And that is by far more than 10 orders of magnitude. There are billions of times more lives at stake than we are currently here on this planet. Secondly, scholars of existential risk stress the concept of anthropogenic risks. Technological threats are by far more likely to cause an extinction-level event in our time frame than the so-called natural risks. Asteroid impacts and supervolcanoes, which we will hear more about later, have left geological records, so statistically, they only occur once in several thousands, 10,000s, hundreds of thousands of years, and that is much more rarely, or the probability is much lower than we expect with regard to technological risks. So, for instance, a nuclear holocaust, by accident or by stupidity, in the opinion of many, could have just become less unlikely after what happened in America 2 weeks ago. Extreme climate change, in this concept, also constitutes a technological threat by internal combustion engines in fossil fuel-powered power plants. So we look forward to Professor Isobe's subsequent lecture on solar flares. How likely these are, what consequences of our exposures could be, and whether we should best understand them as natural or technology-related risks. Drawing such a distinction has very obvious conceptual limitations and is only possible by degree. Again, it is the Japanese example, the 2011 earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear accident, and the subsequent discourses on shinsai and tensai, or hisaisha and higaisha, which demonstrate disasters are socially constructed, and thus every human disaster necessarily has an anthropogenic element. Professor Mori will tell us how this event can be understood as human failure or as human success, for disasters are consequences of human failures to adapt to the environment. Now, what we want to highlight with our concept of anthropogenic risks is our agency as humans, as well as our responsibility as researchers. These are not just intellectual exercises. These are live and critical global challenges that need focused and practical strategies. I will now hand over to Dr. Avin, who can tell us a little bit more about how we can improve our strategies.
Thank you, Julius. Thank you, everyone. It's great to be here. So before I present our new classification system, I think I would motivate it a little bit by arguing why current systems, while very good, might not give us everything we want. So if we look at a list of risks like we saw on the previous slide, we saw all of these separate scenarios, each in their little silo, each very worrying, each definitely meriting of study. But we might wonder, how do we come up with such lists? Some of them come from disaster movies. And our task as researchers is to ask what is tractable, what is plausible, and what is merely fabrication of Hollywood. Some come from very specialized scientific disciplines who study complex systems, they find a scenario within it, and they flag it up. Some come from historical, archaeological, geological study. And some come from mere theoretical speculation, as one might argue is the case for the risk from artificial intelligence. And these are all worthwhile endeavors. But we might worry that they are a bit random or haphazard, and they might leave out perhaps whole categories of risks that we would not see if we do not go systematically about the various domains from which risks can emerge. Particularly, we are worried about the unknown unknowns, or the black swans, that having this semi-random approach leave us prone to. Another worry with this approach that starts from individual risk scenarios is that they don't really draw on the very rich and diverse knowledge there is in academia. If we look at global catastrophic risks, then there is really only one humanity and only one environment that we inhabit, the planetary environment. And the fact that we arbitrarily carve up studying that humanity and that environment into different scientific disciplines is very useful for various purposes, but does not help us when we try to get a holistic picture of how all of these interact. And quite possibly the answer to some of those questions we might want to have when tackling these risks will emerge from disciplines not currently engaged with researching those scenarios. Those kind of motivations lead us to a new classification system. And we start by shifting a little bit from the metaphor of the pale blue dot that Julius so nicely characterized to the metaphor of spaceship Earth. This is a metaphor that I borrow from Jan Tallinn. Jan Tallinn uses this a lot when he tries to explain potential risks from future artificial intelligence. And he says, we can imagine the future as a spaceship we are building in our own backyard. It is very big. The children are the first to board on it. And we have done a lot of work providing a spaceship with very, very powerful engines in terms of very powerful artificial intelligence capabilities. But we may have neglected investing in steering capabilities for that spaceship. When we look more broadly, we can expand that metaphor and realize it is not a metaphor at all. Earth is a form of a spaceship. It takes a very boring journey around the sun, but a very exciting journey in time, hopefully millions of years into the future, where all of our descendants will live. They will live on this spaceship. And unlike the Starship Enterprise, which you can see here in this picture, we did not design Earth. We don't know all of its life support systems, its engineering, etc. And yet we are responsible for it. And something close to this dashboard view of our very complicated system is what exists in various different fields of academia and scientific research. And our classification system aims to draw out all of that information and maybe approximate a little bit, and over the generations more and more, this centralized information hub that tells us where is our spaceship vulnerable, how might these vulnerabilities spread through our spaceship, and how could we mitigate or prevent those risks. So going forward from metaphors to conceptual analysis, after all, my background is in philosophy, and conceptual analysis is what I do. This is how we think about global catastrophic risks. Let me start by saying that this is a framework that is developed by numerous researchers in our center. You may recognize the name of Martin Rees, Julius Weitzdoerfer, who you've heard before, but also I want to name people who are not here today: Bonnie Wintle, Sean O'Hagerty, and Bill Sutherland. We have collaborated on this because this classification system has very many aspects, and none of us could fully formulate this just on our own. So when we think of a global catastrophic risk, what are the necessary ingredients without which a global catastrophe would simply not happen? The first is some breach in a critical system, some system that is required for life. We define a critical system as any system or set of processes that, if disturbed sufficiently or beyond a certain threshold, that disturbance would significantly jeopardize life. We can think, for example, about the cells in our body. They operate as a combined system, and if we disturb their operation in a sufficient way, that could lead to disease. If no system required for life has been jeopardized, there is no catastrophe. The second component is a global spread mechanism. Causes, by nature, have very limited effects. I am speaking to you. You can hear me in this room, but the people in Cambridge cannot hear me. At least not yet, until this video goes online. For some catastrophe to have a fully global effect, there needs to be some causal mechanism, or maybe a cascade of mechanisms, that make that disaster have a global effect. And studying those is a second dimension to our classification system. The third dimension of prevention and mitigation failure starts from what we have all agreed on at the beginning of the talk, which is global disasters are undesirable. Being undesirable, we are likely to want to do something about them. If a catastrophe happened, it is because we, as individuals or through our institutions, failed to do something about it. And breaking down all of the ways these failures could happen is also part of the classification, about which Julius will speak after I have talked over the first two dimensions. So let's jump right into some of the details. In this table, we see two dimensions, the first two dimensions. On the horizontal axis, we have the critical systems, and we have put them into categories of increasing complexity, from very basic physical systems, such as the safe temperature ranges and safe radiation levels that are conducive to life, through biogeochemical systems, such as the global water cycle, which have been studied in quite exemplary work by Rockstrom et al. In their work on planetary boundaries, and our work can be seen as an extension of that framework across several dimensions, upon which we build more complex cellular, anatomical, and whole organism systems, bringing in the richness and complexity of our biological understanding of what it is to be alive and to stay alive. And then we look at systems that comprise numerous organisms, both ecological systems that look at human and non-human animals in a very complex environment, and what are the safe operating ranges for those systems, and socio-technological systems that highlight the technological nature of our very complicated food networks, our resource acquisition networks, our health system, and how these are really quite evolved to maintain 7 billion people on Earth, which also makes them quite fragile. On the vertical axis, we have global spread mechanisms. And we've also broken these down into several categories. The first one is impact through a natural system. So let's start with an example here. This is an illustration of a nuclear winter. And in a nuclear winter situation, there is, of course, the horrifying immediate effect of the bombs hitting the cities. But then there is a secondary and global effect through ash and dust rising to the atmosphere. Wind currents circulate those particles across the globe, reducing incoming solar radiation. Interestingly, this is also how, for many asteroid strike scenarios and for supervolcanic scenarios, these effects manifest. So by looking at a classification system in this way, we see these overlaps starting to emerge. So in this case, we will have a natural spread through the atmosphere and a disruption of physical systems, which leads to this red area in the table, which highlights several risks converging on one point in the classification system. But of course, it is not the chill that will kill us in such situations. Rather, through disrupting photosynthesis, a cellular process, we will have downscale effects on our ecological and socio-technological systems. As our crops fail, as our forests wither, we will see significant harm done to our food systems and other industries that require inputs from biological sources. That will be how nuclear winters, asteroid strikes, or supervolcanic eruptions manifest the global catastrophic potential. And so we see these as focusing on the ecological, socio-technological area. This red over here. A second way in which scenarios could have a global effect is through anthropogenic networks. Humans love traveling everywhere. I was in Britain less than 2 days ago. Now I am here. We have a very busy plane travel around the world. We have very busy transit systems in our cities and between the cities and the countryside. We have very complex utilities networks that bring water into households, at least in the developed world. And of course, these contribute greatly to our quality of life, everything we care about. But they also offer pathways for harmful agents to spread, especially when coupled with the third category of global spread, which is our focus on replicator dynamics. These are various causal agents in the world that could make copies of themselves and thus increase the speed of spread through the world and also how widely they could reach. So for example, if we think about the Ebola virus and how it replicates itself as it comes into contact with more and more people who are unfortunately harmed by it, when this is coupled with our global transit network, or in case of a malicious bioengineering attack that could target some of our utility systems, we could see some of these scenarios taking place, and we see a fairly broad risk footprint for biological threats all the way up from cellular systems through anatomical whole organism systems to ecological and socio-technological. Of course, different viruses will hit different systems, but when we think about resilience, we might think about how do we operate in case of a pandemic spread? How do we build better response systems? How do we reinforce organizations like the World Health Organization? But this will, of course, tie into prevention and mitigation failures that Julius will talk about soon. And a different kind of coupling between anthropogenic systems and replicator dynamics that I want to highlight is pointing out the very complex nature of our current world. We have highly intertwined computer networks, we have the internet, and soon we will have the Internet of Things, which create a vector for spread for digital replicators in the form of computer viruses and worms, that could literally go around the globe at the speed of light. The more of our critical systems are coupled to these digital networks, the more vulnerable we become to those kind of threats, and they could become a global catastrophe. Another kind of replicator that could spread through these systems, but we often neglect, is ideas, particularly dangerous ideas. As we push our understanding of bioengineering, maybe through DIY biology, as we push our understanding of other powerful technologies, for example, artificial intelligence and machine learning, or when we come up with new technologies that could be implemented maybe not by an individual, but by countries, such as geoengineering, we should be very careful about how we handle those ideas, how they spread, and be very careful custodians of them. We've seen such discussion, for example, around gain-of-function experiments in biology, and we expect to see many more of these going into the future. So these will go on cultural and digital replicators on the socio-technological area. And as you can see there are many gray boxes on this classification system, but this is because the work is not done. By having these blank areas, we might, in the same way that the periodic table allowed us to discover new elements, we might be able to use this to uncover some of these unknown unknowns, but for that we need to reach out to the broader scientific and academic community. So I have talked about two dimensions, the dimensions of critical systems that clearly draws on a whole range of disciplines from physical and biological sciences, and also on global spread mechanisms that require quite specialist knowledge in complex system dynamics. And I will now hand over back to Julius to talk about the third dimension.
Thank you very much, Shahar, for your very eloquent and competent illustration of the first two dimensions of our classification system. So the analysis of global catastrophic risk scenarios along our first two dimensions that Shahar has just set out for you, these dimensions of critical systems and spread mechanisms, this draws mainly on our understanding of the natural world and technical systems. Holistic risk management, however, must take into account the human elements that moderate global catastrophic risks through prevention and mitigation efforts, and how these efforts might fail. So this third dimension I'm now going to talk about in our system is about why we fail and what is needed if we want to succeed. The challenge of preventing global catastrophes requires integration of the work and expertise in and between the natural sciences and the social sciences on a global scale. The most comprehensive existing risk management framework, I'm sure you all know it, is the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which was adopted by 187 UN member states last year. Although this framework was developed for conventional, natural, rather than complex technological disasters, it considers many of the potential human factors that influence resilience and vulnerability to an unfolding disaster. So what we do is we take a similar approach here, and we identify potentially fragile areas in the global risk prevention and mitigation system. I'm going to show this in a minute. Rather than aiming for comprehensiveness or exclusivity, we highlight that understanding the interdependent and complex human factors requires input from a wide range of disciplines beyond the natural sciences. So we have structured the dimension of prevention and mitigation failures into 4 levels. The individual level, the what we call interpersonal level, the institutional level, and what we call the beyond institutional level. What we've tried to do here is
to come up with the most important factors that influence our success with regard to prevention and mitigation without adopting the language of one particular discipline. It would have been tempting to use institutional theories and to draw up something, some kind of grid with actors and institutions. It would have been tempting to use the sociological approach of networks. But what we wanted to do is to develop a language that speaks to all the social science disciplines, and rather than using the keywords that have a certain meaning in a certain discipline, we wanted to come up with a system that integrates as many as possible of the social sciences. So when we talk about interpersonal relationships, we want to integrate psychological research. We want to integrate behavioral economics. We want to integrate law and governance and policy studies, which all have very important things to say with regard to prevention and mitigation of disasters. So, for instance, and I'm going to give you some examples now, short-term thinking and a locally limited focus constitute cognitive biases, they affect our risk perception and our risk management, both on the individual and on the institutional level. So disciplines that study this are, for instance, psychology and behavioral economics. More than that, unresolved political conflicts and competing ethical notions of justice can undermine international cooperation and burden sharing, both on the institutional and on the supra-institutional level. One prominent example for this is the struggles to mitigate climate change. The struggles to mitigate climate change are not predominantly hampered by scientific evidence or a disagreement over scientific evidence. They are even more so hampered by differing understandings of how the burden of responsibility is to be shared, who to blame and who is to take responsibility. These are the questions that hinder disagreement between nations. Some risks of those we've talked about today are already the focus of very well-developed institutional systems. For instance, we've got the World Health Organization, WHO, for pandemics. Robust research activity and technical know-how is what these institutions can provide. But for global catastrophic risks from emerging technologies, the institutional mix and the research agenda are only just being established. In fact, it's happening here right now. Conventional disaster response, for instance, recovery and compensation, Saigai Fukko, as we see it in Japan even today, and even newer comprehensive strategies, for example, to build back better after a disaster, are inadequate for addressing threat scenarios where there is limited reaction time and no second chance. For these cases, we need a novel framework that is at least as interdisciplinary as the Sendai framework, but moves away from these monodimensional natural hazards and instead addresses complex anthropogenic risks, which are far more likely to cause a severe global catastrophe. In particular, we have to focus on the prevention and mitigation of multi-dimensional risks, scenarios that involve cascades of socio-technological, natural technological, so-called NATEC, and technological natural disasters. So, as we confront our emergent technological global catastrophic risk scenarios, lessons can be learned from previous smaller disasters in the past. So tomorrow we will hear from Professor Mitsuyama about pest in the Middle Ages and how the pest did not become a global catastrophic risk because it did spread through anthropogenic networks. These anthropogenic networks were the Mongolian invasion, growing population density, and maritime transport in the Middle Ages, but it did not have a global reach. Also, the pest affected a critical system, our very own bodies, but it was not lethal in all cases and was mitigated in part by quarantine measures. And we will have another row of examples in this conference where we hope you can see how our framework plays out. For instance, tomorrow we'll hear about investment decisions for climate change mitigation by Professor Trück, and we can see how institutional resources or the lack thereof influences this. Professor Ohashi will talk about one very classical mitigation measure, insurance, and we can see how reinsurance refinancing failed due to a combination of factors relating to adaptability and risk perception. So a very instructive recent case of a multidimensional disaster scenario, and let me just briefly move back to our framework, is of course the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accident. I have conducted research on this personally, so I think it's a very, very telling case. And this case laid bare failures at the interface of natural, scientific, technological, socioeconomic, legal, and political realms. One such failure was the supervision of Japan's nuclear industry by the very same authorities that were to promote nuclear technology. Such an institutional setup, aggravated by cognitive biases, which we also have here on the slide, for instance, groupthink in the nuclear sector, the Genshiro Kumura, which had revolving doors to the regulator, you know in Japan the phenomenon of amakudari, this was simply lacking the adequate incentive structures for safety, and it was destined to result in conflicts of interest and regulatory capture. As a lawyer, this is my discipline, I find it very, very interesting how nuclear liability, not only in Japan, but around the world, is very much hollowed out or limited and capped, so that basically, if you're the operator of a nuclear power plant, you will not have to worry about your liability because there is almost no liability. For instance, in Britain, the liability ceiling of nuclear liability is below what is the equivalent to 1% of the Fukushima third-party liability. So eventually there is no deterring effect by liability. And that has very adverse effects on safety culture, for instance. So the international science and policy community has the opportunity and the responsibility to co-create better risk prevention and mitigation systems by engaging with researchers in the social sciences and humanities. So the classification framework we presented today is a dynamic framework spanning a broad range of disciplines and reflecting a dense web of interacting variables along 3 dimensions, which we've talked about. But to successfully maintain awareness and to organize the plethora of knowledge around global catastrophic risks, we need to meet the following challenges. Firstly, we need to collect, aggregate, and digest information from highly distributed knowledge networks, overcoming communication barriers and delays. And secondly, we need to update regularly our classification of the GCR scenarios, the gray fields in the grid, as knowledge advances and as technology shapes. So meeting these challenges requires a combination of strategies. We've listed some of them here today for you, but we don't have time to go through all of them. So I would like to pick out an example. And the first example, because I'm the lawyer, I wanted to tell you a little bit about industry and policy engagement, the kind of knowledge sharing we do, and the kind of knowledge sharing we propose. So at CESA, we do our best to have impact by meeting government agencies from around the world. And of course, because we are in England, we work a lot with the Cabinet Office, with the Government Office for Science, and the House of Lords. But we also collaborate with IAPA. This is an intelligence research initiative in the US. In Singapore, we have met representatives from the Center for Strategic Futures, a very interesting governmental agency in Singapore that conducts foresight activities. In Japan, I've met the Ministry of Finance representatives to discuss risk financing, and we collaborate with the Economic Forum and the Holy See. Namely, our economist, Sir Partha Dasgupta, was involved in drafting the encyclica on the environment very recently. It's important, and this is one of the last things I will say, that we are anything but anti-technologists. Even though we focus our research on the management of extreme technological risks, we understand that technology has a huge role to play also in the mitigation of risks. And that's why we also have this industry engagement program, and we are fortunate that very influential technologists are on board with us at CESA, and we've already mentioned Jan Tallinn and Elon Musk, but you will also, you might find it interesting that Hermann Hauser, the Austrian-born co-founder of ARM, which has become very famous in Japan now because it's been bought by SoftBank, are on our advisory boards, and together with them we want to shape a future in which technology can be used in a responsible way and developed and advanced in a responsible way. So I've talked you through some of these things, and because we don't have much time, let me just take out one thing. One thing we have developed and we are continuing to develop at our center is called horizon scanning. Horizon scanning is a very interesting activity, and perhaps we'll have time to talk about it more in the question and answer session. But we do this currently for biorisks, and there are very interesting results coming out of this right now. Finally, what we do and what we want to do together with you is what we call academic engineering. Academic engineering is trying to find out the right combination of experts and generalists from various disciplines in the sciences and in the humanities, and the social sciences as well, to create research projects, networks, and institutions to tackle these existential risks. Because existential risks pose challenges that we haven't faced before. With regard to time, with regard to space, with regard to resources, with regard to international collaboration. And what we do right here, right now, is part of this. It's conducting interdisciplinary workshops. Now, before I close, let me show you these two pictures, which are the nieces on the left-hand side of Shahar and on the right-hand side of myself. And we've chosen these pictures for the closing of our presentation because we've been talking about existential risks for a long time now. And existential risks can seem very abstract. And because existential risk would affect everybody, it's almost like it would affect nobody. And we've chosen these pictures for the end of our presentation to highlight again that when we talk about existential risk, we talk about nothing less than the future of everybody. And this in mind, we would like to thank you again for having us here in Kyoto, and we would like to invite you to visit our website of the Center for the Study of Existential Risk. There's a very nice TED Talk by Martin Rees, which is also subtitled in Japanese, so you can have a look at that again. And also there's an invitation to a conference in December, which we organize from the 12th to the 14th of December, the Cambridge Conference for Catastrophic Risks. And you're all invited to join us there so we can continue what has been started here and to continue the exchange. Thank you very much.